watching around the world and in the future on BGC TV to a birthday party. May not look like a birthday party. There are no balloons and no streamers, but we are celebrating a birthday of a book, and we're celebrating a birthday of a book in a very appropriate way in a lecture sponsored by a journal, West 86, their annual lecture. And in a moment, Paul Sturton, the editor of West 86, will take over as the master of ceremonies this evening. But the book we are celebrating is one I want to say a couple words about. Mechanization Takes Command by Siegfried Giedion was published in 1948, and so it's its 70th birthday. Giedion himself did a lot of eights, was born in 1888 and died in 1968. So we could be celebrating all sorts of anniversaries here tonight. We'll focus on the book. And I also want to mention or just announce its subtitle, which is often ignored and yet is probably just as important, and that is its Mechanization Takes Command, a contribution to anonymous history. We'll come back to that. Adrian Forty, the author of Objects of Desire, seen as really the beginning of design history as a movement, or certainly one of its early classics. Adrian Forty tells the story of how in his first PhD supervision with Rainer Banham, the very first one, Banham said, "You must read Mechanization Takes Command." And in a way, as a book published in 1948 receded into the past, it acquired a certain kind of fuzzy classic status for those interested in design history, questions of modern times and things. It was seen as a kind of venerated ancestor, appropriately distant and kept in the closet, dusted off occasionally in a footnote, but rarely, as it turns out, engaged with. And I don't know, we have the world expert here. Are there other birthday celebrations planned around the world this year? No. I don't think so. It's also not just an important book for design history, and therefore, in some sense, for the prehistory of one of the areas in which Bard Graduate Center works, but it's also a book that raises a very interesting question about what didn't happen. 119 years ago, Ralph Waldo Emerson published 89 years ago, The American Scholar, in 1837, which was really his attempt to try and gauge the differences between a kind of autonomous American scholarship or dependent scholarship, dependent on European scholars. And if we fast forward to 1937 or 1947 and think about the flood into the United States of immigrants fleeing Hitler's Europe, we could again ask this question about the role of native, as it were, American-generated scholarship and scholarship in the United States that was generated by contact between people born in this country and people born outside of the country, especially teachers and scholars. The book, Mechanization Takes Command, was written by one of those people who happened to be in the United States when we were critical. Arnold Hauser in the Art Bulletin was very critical of its German style of scholarship. And I want to read some of the words of Henry Gerlach in the American Quarterly. One doesn't actually read reviews like this anymore because they're not written. The literary method used is itself somewhat stroboscopic. The dull canons of ordinary logic, order, composition, and the historical method cannot, nor are they meant, to apply. His historical approach, let us call it Bauhaus history for short, makes free use of illustration for symbolic purposes and involves a tendency to interpret history in subjective terms by means of free association and magical confrontations. It moves in surrealist fashion, simultaneously on the planes of the prosaic and the symbolical. A trip through this sumptuously illustrated work has something of the effect of a walk through a Dali desert, littered with patent models and spare parts. The MoMA has merged with the Museum of Science and Industry to the greater glory of the subconscious. I don't know if we would feel that way today, but it does say something about this book which is important, and that is the kind of scholarship that rests, upon which it rests. Think of Walter Benjamin, who was one of the avid readers of building in France, who cites it in his own work on Paris in the 19th century. The kind of book that Benjamin was producing is in some sense the kind of book that, that Giedion did produce. And it reminds us that there was a possibility of American scholarship on design and architecture looking different. And that didn't happen. And opportunities that come and are missed are often just as telling and important for the historian as those that are seized. And with that, I will stop and turn the floor over to my colleague, Paul Sturton.
Thank you, Peter. Well, this, of course, is, we're here partly under the aegis of West 86, and are very pleased that we're able to hold a lecture like this. Previous speakers have included Deborah Silverman, David Friedberg, and I'm sure we're in for something similar in the way that it addresses some of the large questions of design history and material culture this evening. Now, there's something about mechanization takes command, which I think almost requires people to describe how they first came into contact with it. And in my case, it was having emerged from many years of higher education in philosophy and art history. I had to go into the world of work, which the first job that I was offered was as a design historian, which I accepted without really knowing what the job involved. And within a few weeks, it was fairly obvious that my knowledge of Gauguin and symbolist art theory wasn't very helpful. But a couple of my older colleagues pointed out to me that I should start by reading Pevsner, a fairly straightforward history of design reform leading into the modern movement. But I should also read Mechanization Takes Command. Now, for Giedion, he was trying to address the question of how technology has changed the way we think about ourselves, but also how we relate to our surroundings. And taking abstract concepts like movement, comfort, cleanliness, and such like, he takes us on a rather profound examination of how we are changed by technology and how we remain ignorant of this change, how we are alienated from the processes that have brought us to modern life. Now, Giedion wrote that to treat the materials of everyday experience, he had to engage in anonymous history. But this has become, as we've heard, something of a catchphrase for the book. But it's more than that. While he laments the fact that the sources are often missing for the history of design, and its basic things, he's acknowledging also that a true history of design is not about chairs by Le Corbusier or textiles by Annie Albers, but it's about the things that we take for granted, the substructure that supports modern life, in which he says we are not so much alienated from as being ignorant of their presence. Now, it's not so much anonymous history, therefore, that he's concerned with, but the history of everything else, something which is almost impossible to write about. That's why Mechanization Takes Command, I think, is both the most inspiring and at the same time the most depressing book to read, because it's addressing a question that cannot be solved or answered, and yet it should be for design historians the single greatest task in hand. Now, I'm hoping, therefore, that tonight we're going to be told what those tasks mean, how we might approach them, and tonight's speaker is going to help us understand what Giedion is aiming for. Sokratis Georgiadis is Professor of Architecture and Design History at the State Academy of Art and Design at Stuttgart, where his research interests include architectural history and theory of the 19th and 20th century. Although more recently, I gather, he's interested in the architecture of his native country, ancient Greece. But he's made a special study of Siegfried Giedion, writing the great man's biography in 1989 and preparing Giedion's Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferro-Concrete for the Getty's indispensable text and documents series. He's currently working on an edition of Giedion's unfinished text, Die Entstehung des heutigen Menschen, the development of contemporary man. Now, if mechanization takes command wasn't a formidable task in hand, the development of contemporary man sounds equally formidable. We will hear more about that perhaps later, but tonight we're going to be looking at technology, wondrous or fatal. Please welcome our speaker tonight, Sokratis Georgiadis.
Well, thank you for the friendly introductions, also for the hospitality. What I will do today is to read the book, Read Mechanization Takes Command, against the background of the previous writings of Giedion from 1928 on. And propose a new reading of the book, or a differentiated reading of the book. I wouldn't disclose what this means. I think it will come out during and after the lecture. So I will be reading from my manuscript. It's more comfortable for you and for me as well. At the start of 1952, after more than 5 years of teaching at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, the ETH, in Zurich, a 64-year-old Siegfried Giedion asked asked Linus Birchler, who was at the time the full professor for art history at the same school, for a personal talk, a discussion among art historians. This talk, however, never came about. Birchler's answer to the request, which had Giedion sent by letter, read as follows. Discussions about religion have never served the cause of peace, as history teaches us. And in my view, Siam is a religion. He was alluding to Giedion's role as a general secretary of the International Congresses of Modern Architecture, the CIAM. That avant-garde organization of modern architecture, and indeed referred him to the department's architects who would be of like mind. It might be more appropriate for you to sit around a table with the 3 architecture colleagues in our department for a friendly discussion. A good 10 years earlier, Giedion had sent his then newly published book, Space, Time and Architecture, which later went on to become one of the most successful architecture books of the 20th century, to Heinrich Wölfflin. Wölfflin had supervised Giedion's doctoral thesis, submitted in Munich in 1922. The renowned art historian reacted in a polite yet awkward and resigned manner to his former student's gesture. He wrote him, "I haven't truly succeeded at mastering the material. It isn't just the alien language that makes it difficult for me, but also the generational difference. You stand for the present, while I belong to a period past. and can only from a distance peer into the land of the future. In his career, Giedion was often confronted with rejection and incomprehension. The mistrust, coming especially from the Guild of Art Historians, had some grounds. Giedion was working too closely to his historical material to satisfy scientific premises. Temporal distance from the object of research was a condition of objectivity. Besides, Giedion was particularly exposed to accusations of bias because he mixed his work as a historian with his participation in the daily political business of architecture, that is, as an activist in the modern movement. He thereby let the borders between history, theory, criticism, project, and propaganda be blurred. Even though it had been known to historiographers since Max Weber's essay on objectivity that contemporary value ideas could influence scientific judgment, Giedion's conduct still represented a transgression tantamount to hybris as far as serious historiography was concerned. In 1968, in the year of Giedion's death, the Italian art historian Manfredo Tafuri summarized this criticism in a most forceful and succinct way. Referring in particular to Giedion, he attributed the coalescence of history and project to the category of so-called operative criticism. This kind of criticism, Tafuri stressed, is contesting towards past history and prophetic towards the future. It has as its objective the planning of a precise poetical tendency anticipated in its structures and derived from historical analysis, programmatically distorted and finalized. Tafuri's attack occurred against the background of a widespread fundamental critique of modernist functionalism. Its impact was thus amplified. The scientific credibility of Giedion's project was sorely damaged. To distance oneself from Giedion was no longer only part of art history's conversational etiquette, it became an indispensable ingredient of the historiographical orthodoxy in the aftermath of modernism. The opposite was the case with Giedion's reception among architects. The success of his books remained uninterrupted for decades. The constant new editions and volume of translations is unmistakable proof. Space, Time, and Architecture, in particular, here is Tafuri's book. This is the cover of the first edition of Space, Time, and Architecture. This book, in particular, exercised and still exercises an irresistible fascination, even upon younger architects, that seems to defy all criticism. In turn, Giedion himself made no secret of his inner connectedness and even his mental affinity with the artists and architects of his time. He never grew tired of emphasizing that it was from them that the decisive impetus for his work came. By that, he of course didn't mean the entire art world, but only that segment of artists and architects whom he saw as the architects of the future and adepts of the present, as Nietzsche used to say, and who displayed a similarly affirmative stance towards the forces of modernity. However, he didn't only share an unconditional faith in modernity, but also a specifically poetic view of the world, an intuitive insight and understanding of aspects of reality which were inaccessible to reason. Giedion's understanding of modernity, like that of many of his fellow combatants, above all Le Corbusier, was to a large extent bound to the conviction of the culture and style-forming power of technology. Regarding architecture, this stance was not particularly new. Already in the mid-19th century, significant theoreticians such as Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc in France or Karl Bötticher in Germany had very similar opinions. But what Giedion was thinking about differently was that technology's form-generating power had meanwhile entirely overrun historicism. Convinced by technology's cultural dominance, he was doing so in such a radical way that he was even prepared to consider the possibility of an entirely new definition of architecture beyond the discipline's boundaries. Thus, in his 1928 book, Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferroconcrete, he wrote, "Architecture is linked to the concept of monumentality. When new building materials, iron and ferroconcrete, assume the forms of gravity and monumentality, they're essentially misused. It seems doubtful whether the limited concept of architecture will indeed endure." Giedion's preoccupation with technology continued undiminished in the following decades and reached its peak in his 1948 publication, Mechanization Takes Command, regardless of his critical remarks accompanying an allegedly uncontrolled technological advance. Giedion now no longer limited his technicist approach to architecture, but stretched his respective investigations to all conceivable areas of material culture during the industrial era. However, it was precisely this somewhat unusual interdisciplinary stance that utterly astounded his readers and reviewers, as you said before. Judging Mechanization Takes Command from the perspective of their own respective disciplines, they wondered whether it was a treatise in art history, in the history of technology, social history, or anthropology. Some who saw a lack of scholarly rigor in Giedion's frequent use of poetic language even wondered whether Mechanization Takes Command wasn't, in the end, a piece of literature. Somehow, the book didn't want to fit into any of the aforementioned disciplines. Stanislaus von Moos once wrote that the book was a kind of a junk room. He presumably meant that it was a junk room of the history of technology and industry. A cabinet of wonders and curiosities would seem to me a better comparison. A comparison with the collections meticulously compiled by European noblemen, but also private scholars in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. These collections were made up of every conceivable object of nature, from earth, seas, and skies, as well as products of human ingeniousness and talent. They were presented as microcosms of the whole universe. Indeed, Mechanization Takes Command appears as a compilation of microhistories. Giedion himself used the term discontinuous treatment, referring to the most varied fields of material production, consumption, and recreation. Giedion was particularly interested in the repercussions of a technological rationality spreading wildly and in a totalizing manner. He was interested in its effects on organic life, the everyday, and people's psychological condition. Considering Giedion's background, academic background in art history, the inventory of his cabinet of wonder and curiosities displayed in Mechanization Takes Command must have looked most curious. physiological experiments of movement on animal and human bodies, assembly lines, automated slaughter facilities, cereal machines and appliances for the mechanic production of bread, instruments for the artificial fertilization of animals, convertible barber and dental chairs, kitchen appliances, bathrooms, rail cars, and much more. Those were his objects. At the beginning, there was always the technical genius and a groundbreaking invention. At the end, there was nature or the human body, instrumentalized by technology as another cog in the machine or as a passive recipient of machine-led operations. In addition, Giedion built bridges between art on the one hand and machines that brought both blessings and misery on the other, because of a suspected or indeed existing aesthetic resonance which these objects and processes elicited in modern artists, such as Marcel Duchamp, Vassily Kandinsky, Fernand Léger, Juan Miró, Paul Klee, Pablo Picasso, or Max Ernst. Reproductions of the paintings were flaunted in the book's pages next to machines, diagrams, objects of daily use, and devices of all kinds. The difference from the classic cabinet of wonder was, on the one hand, that Giedion's collection was limited to artifacts and objects of art, and on the other, that it could not claim completeness, but had to be content with the fragments of the technological universe that had meanwhile grown out of proportion. Fragments, though, were no disadvantage for Giedion. On the contrary, they were part of the program. Mere fragments lifted from the life of a period can reveal its habits and feelings. One must have the courage to take small things and raise them to large dimensions, he wrote in Space, Time and Architecture, and he added that this was a lesson he had learned from contemporary art. And in Mechanization Takes Command, he noted, history writing is ever tied to the fragment. The known facts are often scattered broadcast like stars across the firmament. It should not be assumed that they form a coherent body in the historical night. Consciously, then, we represent them as fragments and do not hesitate, when necessary, to spring from one period to another. Pictures and words are but auxiliaries. The decisive step must be taken by the reader. In his mind, the fragments of meaning here displayed should become alive in new and manifold relations. In any case, an aura of magic and wonder, implicitly or explicitly, surrounded Giedion's collection, regardless of whether the machines he had incorporated were mere toys or useful devices. The writer's fascination with modern technology was constantly present, even in the book's most critical terms. As an overture, a section headed by the word movement appeared in the book. Since the beginnings of his encounter with modern art, Giedion was of the firm conviction that movement molded the perception of reality in modern times. Whether in the area of technology, science, or art, modern reality defied the static gaze and required a perception in motion. Not least, the art historian in Siegfried Giedion employed this fundamental conviction in modern architecture. It was only through film that the floating transparency of Le Corbusier's architectural creations could be grasped, Giedion noted in his book, Building in France, in 1928. Movement was the state of those who observed an object, who approached it or distanced themselves from it, who ran around it or through it. Movement was also the state of the apparatuses that captured and projected images of the objects in all their diversity, whether as a change in location for the observer or a change in location for the cinematographic processes. Movement consistently meant movement of the gaze. In other words, movement was the motor of perception. It therefore belonged to the sphere of aesthetics. Giedion continued to work on the issue of movement in his seminal Space-Time and Architecture, and associated movement again with the fundamental event of modernity, that is, the emergence of a mechanized civilization accompanied by industrialization. Giedion illustrated the related introductory comments with the image of a writing doll, one of the three automatons produced by Georgiadis around 1770, which are today kept in Neuchâtel's Art History Museum in Switzerland. For Giedion, this object had an emblematic significance. An extraordinary inventive drive was condensed in it, a drive that suddenly emerged in the 18th century and acted, so to speak, as an initial ignition for rapid technological development. Giedion's interest in the history of automatons dates back to his extensive studies on the formation of contemporary man, an incomplete project on the 19th century history of civilization, which he had been working on from 1929 to 1938, that is, until his first trip to America. In it, he was discussing those machines from the second half of the 18th century that were not only modeled on the outer appearance of humans and animals, but were also able or capable to mechanically imitate the movements, gestures, and activities. Giedion described Jacques de Vaucanson's flautists, drummers, artificial duck in detail. He did the same with Baron Wolfgang von Kempelen's speaking machine and his famous chess player, whom Giedion, like others before him, exposed as a fraud. Finally, he paid special attention to the androids of Pierre Georgiadis and his son Henri Louis. Having completed a degree in mechanical engineering before his degree in art history, Giedion was able to reveal with greatest accuracy and attention to detail, the mechanical build and workings of the writer android, which was inspired by clockwork. The essence of automatons of that time is based on an extremely refined analysis and composition of movements, he wrote in The Formation of Modern Man. These movements were, however, different from those described in Building in France. That is to say, movement no longer served to support or even enable a particular modality of perception, especially vision. That is, what Giedion's friend Laszlo Moholy-Nagy described as vision in motion. Movement wasn't understood from an aesthetic point of view, but referred to mechanical processes that took place in apparatuses. The point was about movement that resulted from a mechanical transformation of energy. Giedion correctly highlighted the uselessness of these machines and the fact that their sole purpose had been to playfully awaken the impression of the wonderful and to arouse public curiosity. At the same time, he didn't miss putting the automatons into the temporal framework of their creation a framework that the eruption of technological genius was drastically shaking. The inventions of Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Crompton's mule, and Arkwright's water frame, for example, that could be used in the industrial production, and the wonderful, almost albeit purposeless, toy automatons were indeed contemporaneous. In both useful and useless machines, a human drive to invent, that is, an anthropological constant that accompanied technological endeavors since time immemorial, became evident according to Giedion, hence also his archaeological excursions into the time of the Ptolemies, the time of Ctesibius, of Philon or Hero of Alexandria, into the world of ancient water organs, water clocks, the first compressed air guns, singing bird automatons, magically opening temple doors, automaton theaters, and so on. According to Giedion, it was here that the questions and ways of thinking taken up again as models in the 18th century were firstly developed. In comparison, a different aspect of those modern ways of thinking appeared relatively underexposed in Giedion's explications, namely what he, in philosophical terms, called the mechanistic worldview, which after all propelled and promoted the inventive drive in the second half of the 18th century. Giedion noted that the abstracting philosophical foundation of the inventive outbreak could be traced back to Descartes. However, he spent surprisingly little time on it, and what is perhaps more important, he left out the new anthropology of the 18th century, which led to a completely new conception of man and thereby also to a radically new definition of human corporeality. At that moment, Giedion was still so enthralled by the construction of automatons, be that in the shape of the sublime toy, or in the shape of the working automaton or semi-automaton that promised freedom from corporeal effort, that he lost any objective distance he might have had. Consequently, he overlooked that the wonderful world of inventions, which promised blessings, wasn't only met with affirmative amazement by those who experienced it, but also fear of impending misery. Indeed, although he mentioned E.T.A. Hoffmann's Olympia, he ignored the existential fear that the soulless machinery readily provoked at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century and later. The idea of the artificial man, or even a human being supported by prosthesis, was considered plainly uncanny until late into the 19th century. A few literal testimonies for this would include the revival of the golem myth in German literature, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as well as Poe's story about the unfortunate general who could only continue to exist as a bricolage of body parts artificially put together. Finally, it remained beyond Giedion's perspective that the practical implementation of the 18th century's useful inventions and machine-supported industrial production presupposed bodies bred to conform to machines. Admittedly, they did not presuppose automaton humans or androids, but indeed human automatons that could operate machines and should function according to the same principle as those machines. The principle was a refined dismantlement and assembly of movements. Giedion continued the discussion about invention and automatization in Mechanization takes command. The general subject exhibited great similarities with his studies for his incomplete project from the 1930s. As I mentioned before, a history of modern culture in the 19th century seen within the framework of mechanization and industrialization. The emphasis in Mechanization takes command had nonetheless shifted to America. In the book's introductory parts, he once again told the story, starting from antiquity, of the inventions of automatons, but in much shorter form this time. In contrast to his earlier studies, however, one could notice a striking shift in content. The inventors of androids had this time disappeared from the section of the 18th century. Searching for names such as Jacques Dreux or von Kempelen would have been in vain. Only Jacques de Vaucanson escaped oblivion simply because he was the only one to let components of his toy inventions slide into the field of useful applications. These omissions announced a change in perspective that cannot be overestimated and that significantly distance Mechanization takes command from Giedion's previous studies. The world of mighty images was admittedly still present, but was now joined by the world of vulnerable bodies, as we will see shortly. Mechanization takes command was a product of the war years, the greater part of which Giedion spent in the United States. He visited America for the first time in the autumn of 1938 and stayed in Cambridge until March 1940. Through the mediation of Walter Gropius, he had been offered the opportunity to give the Charles Eliot Norton lectures at Harvard. As is well known, the outcome of these lectures was his famous book, Space, Time and Architecture. During his first stay in America, his project, The Formation of Modern Man, of Contemporary Man, remained on ice. But even during his temporary return to Switzerland, he couldn't bring himself to continue his studies on this project. He variously complained to friends about the unfavorable working conditions in Switzerland and the psychological burden due to the difficult political climate. While there, he received an invitation to give 3 lectures at Yale, at the School of Fine Arts, on May 16 of 1941. He accepted without hesitation. Thus he left Zurich on August 11 and reached Lisbon via southern France and Spain, from where he flew to the United States on a Pan Am Clipper. On August 26, he landed in New York. The luggage with his work materials, among them the lecture notes for Yale, which consisted of no more than 1 briefcase, reached him later by diplomatic courier through Switzerland's Department of Foreign Affairs. He spent the remaining war years in America. Therewith, the fate of his project about the formation of contemporary man was sealed. Already, during his first day in America, he was preoccupied with how America was developing, as he said. At first, as part of his Norton lectures at Harvard. As is well known, the 5th chapter of Space, Time and Architecture is dedicated to this subject, where Giedion unfurled an entire panorama of American architecture from the balloon frame construction, Henry Hobson Richardson, and the so-called Chicago School to Frank Lloyd Wright. Furthermore, in the 11th and final chapter of the book, American urbanism played a substantial role. As is apparent from countless letters to companies, public institutions, private individuals, and so on, Giedion had started collecting material for the history of industrialization in the United States already at that time. In the meantime, he wrote to the architect Oskar Stonorov in September 1941, that is, upon his return to the United States, "I'm continuing work on a book about an American topic, which I had started 2 years ago." Doubtlessly, he meant Mechanization Takes Command, a project that he would be working on until December 1945. Already in the book's preface, he described how his search for the effects of mechanization had led him onto the tracks of an archaeology of industrial development. At the center of his research was the 19th century, that is, the time during which the foundations of industrial civilization were laid in the United States. He set as his goal to capture it in its entire breadth and complexity. Since his studies for the formation of contemporary man in the 1930s, Giedion, apart from dealing with the triumph of industrialization in Europe, and especially in England and France, he was predominantly preoccupied with the consequences of technological, economic, and social modernization on the psychological realm of those affected, that is, on the world of human emotions and feelings. He believed that the experience of modernity was, in this respect, one of rupture. He described this experience as a split between thought and feeling. He understood it as a sort of signature of modernity, at least during its initial phase. Artistic phenomena, especially broadly accepted art that was able to please the public, that is, historicist and eclecticist art, were symptomatic of this split and the loss of equilibrium of the modern man. Giedion saw art as the key to reality and thereby as a mental lab of society as a whole. Its current forms of expression indicated that art was unable to keep up with the onslaught of science, industry, and technology, which were overrunning it and leaving it behind. The only resort for art was harking back to the past, an altogether tragic alternative. The idea of the split reappeared in space-time and architecture and constituted the general tenor, as it were, of the investigation. Giedion, however, believed that a convergence was again underway at the beginning of the 20th century. He believed that the realms of knowledge on the one hand and expression on the other were in the process of sharing the same direction, a state of cultural unity that had not existed since the Baroque period seemed to re-emerge. It promised a long-term development, the growth of a new tradition, as the subtitle of Space-Time and Architecture indicated. Giedion believed to have detected this parallel, this identity of methods, as he called it, in an assumed consonance between the new insights of natural sciences at the beginning of the 20th century, especially Einstein's theory of relativity, and the optical revolution of modern painting, particularly Cubism. He continued this very theme in Mechanization Takes Command, only that any trace of the so ardently desired unity had now vanished again, altogether, barely 7 years after the publication of Space, Time and Architecture. Instead, the split returned to the fore with unprecedented force. This shift, in his view, can hardly be explained through the largely fierce criticism alone with which the idea of identity of methods was met, one of its most prominent critics being Einstein himself. As has already been touched upon, mechanization was not exclusively focused on the changes in the fields in the field of material production in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as in the formation of contemporary man, Giedion was interested to at least the same extent in the kind of phenomena that pointed towards wide-ranging changes in the human condition as a whole. He pursued those changes no more exclusively in the field of autonomous art, but in that of applied art as well. The mechanization of human surroundings gained a central position. His account on this topic started in the 5th chapter of this book of Mechanization with a polemic against the so-called ruling taste exhibited in the objects of everyday use. Under the conditions of mechanization, it first manifested itself or found its initial application in the style empire of the imperial Napoleonic years. Ruling taste, above all, meant the devaluation of symbols, that is, the dissociation of the formal and symbolic apparatuses of architecture and craft from their original contexts and their functionally alienated and semantically distorted usage. Closely connected with this was the devaluation of ornament, of material, and of space, the last being finally appropriated and fatally appropriated by the upholsterer. This assessment was by no means particularly unique or innovative. Already 100 years before, similar voices were to be heard. For example, the arts and crafts movement in Britain or the German architect Gottfried Semper held comparable ideas. Between Semper and Giedion, there were similarities even down to the choice of words. Giedion made reference to both, especially the English reformers. The century became dissatisfied with itself as soon as it touched upon the sphere of emotions, he wrote in a note contained in the materials of his unfinished book of the 30s. He continued, it was obvious that something wasn't right in the fields of literature, painting, sculpture, and architecture. However, the escape routes where one was looking for were generally no more than conclusions from analogies, retrograde developments. This observation could now be confirmed in Mechanization Takes Command, and namely in the life world as a whole. Back then, in the 1930s, the century's plight for Giedion, as for his predecessors 100 years ago or earlier, was merely a crisis regarding ideas and means of expression. The inability of art to cope with the new reality of industrialization on a level of language. Mechanization Takes Command, he considered the devaluation of symbols, or more generally, the ruling taste of the 19th century, also as utter nonsense, an absurdity, an irrationality even. About the stuffy, muggy interiors of that period, he wrote, what emanated from this chaotic setting, what repercussions shook our moral constitution cannot be conveyed in rational terms. No logic, no sociological account can portray the situation. Artistic symbols alone are adequate. It was among the surrealists' functions to reveal this. They captured the sense and nonsense of the 19th century and showed how the inextricable mixture of the banal and the eerie had penetrated our being. No one did so more pungently than Max Ernst. Giedion, however, categorically stated that what was happening at the linguistic and symbolic levels, and what art, and especially surrealist art, was capturing as a social seismograph was but a symptom of a much deeper crisis, pervading not language alone, but all of human existence. Again, in Mechanization takes command, we learn, and this precisely is the significant difference compared to his earlier ideas, that not only did the crisis affect language, expression, or human software, but also in equal measure human hardware, that is, the body. That is the book's actual new perspective. In some ways, Mechanization can indeed be read as a book about the body under the ruling conditions of mechanization. This might appear to be reminiscent of what Giedion's teacher Heinrich Wölfflin was claiming in his early work back in the 1880s, namely that the corporeal being had a decisive influence on stylistic creation. Of course, a style can only emerge where a strong sense is alive for a certain type of corporeal being. That is what the Swiss art historian wrote in 1886. On closer inspection, however, this parallel turns out to be superficial. The body, as Wölfflin understood it, was animated. Its formation, posture, and movement were an expression of affects. It possessed expressive properties and was therefore an agent of stylistic change and consequently of change in architectural language. Giedion's view was different. At first, he explicated his perception of the modern corporeal condition on animal bodies. Illustration number 2 in Mechanization takes command showed a frog lying prone on a plate with its legs and arms nailed to it. 2 electrodes affixed to the frog's body formed part of a complex device through which the frog's muscular twitches were recorded on a rotating cylinder while electrical current was being fed into its body. The device was Etienne Jules Marais' myograph, invented in the 1860s for the recording of movement and its graphic representation. Giedion continued with descriptions of similar experiments on human bodies. The German physiologist and anatomist Ernst Heinrich Weber's depiction of the successive positions of a human skeleton walking were as much to be observed in the pages of Mechanization takes command as the French physiologist Etienne Jules Marais' graphic representation of how a leg moved while running or jumping from a height, or an athlete descending a staircase, one of the British photographer Edward Muybridge's several chronophotographic series of images on the theme, the human figure in motion. These visual experiments, Giedion claimed, at first resulted from a research interest that lacked a recognizable practical aspect. This aspect, however, emerged as soon as this knowledge left the laboratory to be applied to the mechanization of human labor. The inalienable condition of scientific management and assembly line, Taylorism and Fordism, consisted of absolute control over human bodies and the movements and their subordination to the machine dictate in accordance with the role model of the frog experiment. This body was no longer animated, but shackled. It wasn't a speaking agent, but subject to rationalization. Giedion accompanied the numerous graphic and photographic depictions of the body experiments with pictures by modern artists, such as Marcel Duchamp here, or Wassily Kandinsky, Juan Miró, Picasso, or Paul Klee. As mentioned above, these comparisons were meant to make evident the actual, supposed, intended, or accidental formal similarities. The suggestive power, however, no longer served as proof of a suspected parallel between the respective methods of thinking and feeling. Besides, the question as to whether these artworks were poetic reactions to the new layers of knowledge that science had accessed, or the artistic processing of the drama and trauma of mechanization, remained unanswered. The body's usurpation by the machine and its use for the fulfillment of practical purposes took clear shape in the second half of the 19th century. The numerous documents from America's patent office in Giedion's archive largely date back to that time. He had been tenaciously and purposefully collecting them in America to use them as basic material for large parts of Mechanization Takes Command. He made perfectly clear in his book that he was hoping to gain from the patents what he was hoping to gain from the patents. If we turn so often to the patent drawings, it is as objective witnesses, although the drawings in themselves often have an artistic directness that distinguishes them from the technical routine of a later time. In them, no small portion of folk art lies concealed. He also mentioned the reasons for his decision to focus on his investigation, especially on the second half of the 19th century, namely that inventors were then concentrating on replacing manual labor with machine labor and on the mechanization of the human environment. Thus, Giedion was by no means primarily concerned with the aesthetic qualities of the patented objects or their graphic representation. The comparison between folk artist and patent office applicant, the allegedly anonymous inventor, referred to the production of immediacy, which both had in common. In other words, if folk art figured as the mirror image of the state of America's national psyche, as he wrote, then the patent drawings were the unmistakable evidence of instrumental reason in its purest form. With the help of this objective historical evidence, Giedion designed an archaeology of techniques which, during the first machine age, led to the control of the human body and, more broadly, to the control of nature as a whole. His explanations suggested that the two controls were linked. This patent, an automatic hog weighing apparatus, was a link in the chain of inventions that aimed at industrializing slaughter. The operational principle of this machine had already been applied to other steps in the same process in the 1870s. After catching, killing, scalding, scarping, the hogs are hung from the overhead rail at 24-inch intervals and moved continuously past a series of workers. Each man performs a single operation. One splits the animal, the next takes out the entrails, the third removes heart, liver, etc., and the hosman washes. Giedion cited out of Harper's Weekly. The principle of the assembly line labor was here being realized in an exemplary manner. It was presumably invented in the slaughterhouses of Cincinnati at the end of the 1860s, and its application was later generalized. The slaughterhouse story made clear that the mechanically controlled human body was being deployed to exercise control over animal bodies. What is more, it was meant to do so in an absolute manner, namely as an instrument of death. Initially, Giedion traced in detail the processes of killing based on a series of related patterns. Apparatus for catching and suspending, hog cleaning machine, instrument for extracting hair from skins with the respective patents, pig scalping machine. The development of this murder machinery, he wrote, can best be surveyed in the files of the Patent Office at Washington. The sole purpose of the drawing in the Patent Office is to illustrate the patent claim as clearly as possible, yet freely viewed in their continuity without regard to the technical interpretation and significance. They strike us as a dance macabre of our time. Such an instrumentalization of the human body had consequences on how the human thought machine understood the world and itself. This neutrality toward death may be lodged deep in the roots of our time. It did not bear itself on a large scale until the war, when whole populations, as defenseless as the animals hooked head downwards on the traveling chain, were obliterated with trained neutrality. Giedion's collection of patents was, however, not limited to the mechanization of death, or more generally, the effects of mechanization on organic substance. It wasn't limited to the accompanying attack of the human body during its deployment in the field of material production in the Taylorist Fordist factory either. More than the second half of Mechanization Takes Command was dedicated to the mechanization of life after work. This included the mechanization of the home, the household, and the bath. The body's comfort, reproduction, and care took center stage here. In treating this complex, Giedion was conspicuously less critical than his explorations on the mechanized production sites of America's 19th and 20th centuries. But irrespective of his differentiated judgment, the mechanization of leisure equipment seemed no less problematic than that of the workplace after all. This, at any rate, emerged from the comprehensive visual material and the lucid description of objects. The compact collection of patents and other, mostly photographic documents about the evolution of the barber chair was typical of this. The models are part of the Giedion archive in Zurich. The purpose of these pieces, the purpose of this piece of furniture, which belonged to the category of combined, convertible, adjustable, and specialized chairs, was no doubt body care and hygiene combined with a generation of bodily well-being. Even in the fulfilling of this purpose, however, the guiles of rationalization were present everywhere. The specialized chairs were marked by the mobility of their parts, which made an almost limitless diversity of positions possible. Those positions often run counter to natural bodily postures. A criterion for the adjustability, refinement, and perfection of the chair, which at the same time challenged the very body sitting, learning or leaning or lying on it to adjust was the effectiveness of interventions onto or into the body. The body remained powerless, unable to resist, a passive recipient of the actions and operations aimed at it. A dental and operating chair appeared alongside the barber chair, a chair equipped with a vibrating massaging device, a perfect barbershop machine, not a toy, as the manufacturer explained. Both were examples of the conscious interplay of the body with the mechanism of the chair, as Giedion commented, during which a state of hovering equilibrium was being generated. The visual material included with his remarks, however, left no room for doubt. Even if under a different sign, the effects of mechanization in the area of recreation were indeed comparable to and complemented those in the sphere of production. They consisted in the total control of the body, and the attack on the hardware reached a level of totality hitherto unknown. Giedion concluded his account of the mechanization of the human environment by returning yet again to the formal aspect. As far as furniture design was concerned, he was particularly conscious of the deficiencies of the traditional formal repertoires at the interface between body and modern mechanics. On the contrary, the achievements of modern design, from Tonet's chairs to Mart Stam's and Marcel Breuer's elastic cantilever chairs, and from Le Corbusier's and Charlotte Perrion's chaise-longue basculante to Arthur's cantilever chair of laminated plywood represented as evidence of design ideas finally liberated from the tyranny of ruling taste. They hardly exhibited, at least at the formal level, any points of connection with the constituent furniture of the 19th century, the mobile constructions of the anonymous inventors. But how did they behave, these pieces? How did they behave functionally? How did this furniture relate to the body in particular? Did it continue controlling bodies? Or were there metaphorical projections of the machine-bred body? Or did they aim to protect the body from the harassment by mechanization? Giedion left these questions unanswered. As the subtitle of the book reveals, mechanization was meant as a contribution to anonymous history. But what was this anonymous history really? In actual fact, nothing in mechanization was anonymous. Neither the patent documents that Giedion had used in abundance, nor the accompanying images from the stock of modern painting. A patent for an invention is the agent of a property right to the inventor issued by the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The office of the same name declares today. Since the patent office's founding years, applicants to that office wanted to secure their intellectual property with their applications and have their role as originators confirmed by the state. That is, to achieve the immediate opposite of anonymity. On the other hand, there wasn't even one among the modern artists to renounce his role as an author despite the occasional rhetoric about apparently collective forms of expression, as Theo van Doesburg used to say. New design has to be collective and anonymous, demanded Giedion. And yet, despite the rhetoric of standardization and typification, which was meant to propel new architecture into the era of industrialization, architects showed little willingness to give up the traditional authorial role. In Building in France, Giedion wrote that construction in the 19th century played the role of subconscious. Outwardly, construction still boasts the old pathos. Underneath, concealed behind facades, the basis of our present existence is taking shape, he wrote. Obviously, this diagnosis was far from being the result of a deep psychoanalysis of the actors. What Giedion had to say about the subconscious was in fact meant metaphorically. It meant that there was a kind of undercurrent in the 19th century, in the architecture of the 19th century, a force working under the skin, as it were, which was orchestrating events without ever surfacing. Ultimately, this was an anonymous constructive force that could not be grasped analytically or rationally, but was only accessible by intuition. In his unfinished project from the 1930s, Giedion attempted for the first time to capture the concept of anonymous history more precisely. In a related note, one can read, "We're interested in biological becoming, the process of life and its intersection with reality. The events of the day, the little communications, and the books of contemporaries that lack any particular brilliance shed indispensable light on this context. This anonymous history forms the substratum of our account." But a history from below, histoire en miettes, never came of it. In Mechanization takes command, the same idea reappeared more emphatically. The historical undercurrent was now identified as the inventive drive that triggered mechanization and subsequently channeled it into utilitarian aims, thus profoundly shaking the existential ground of humanity and throwing humanity out of balance. The meaning of history arises in the uncovering of relationships, he wrote. That is why the writing of history has less to do with facts as such than with the relations. These relations will vary with a shifting point of view, for like constellation of stars, they are ceaselessly in change. This was one of the first sentences of the book. In Mechanization Takes Command, however, Giedion did not deal with relationships alone, but to at least an equal degree with facts, pure facts. As for the presentation, he proceeded in a way that any positivist historian would have envied. But as soon as he went on to work on the establishing of relations, he suddenly threw everything into the scales of intuition, switching to a poetic, metaphorical language and becoming suggestive and imprecise. He somnambulantly gathered his objects into modernity's virtual cabinets of wonder, traced their genealogies, detected connections between them that no one had ever suspected, and interpreted them in his highly idiosyncratic and suggestive manner, either as a blessing or a curse of modern civilization. But the most important relation, the relation to real life, ultimately remained nebulous. Christoph Pommier once defined collections of curiosities as a set of natural or artificial objects kept temporarily or permanently out of the economic circuit, afforded special protection in enclosed places adapted specifically for that purpose and put on display. Until the end, mechanization takes command remained also an enclosure. Trapped in the capillaries of his allegedly anonymous history, Giedion missed the driving forces of industrial development. It was the social, economic, and political driving forces of industrial civilization that were left unnamed, anonymous. This was the real anonymous history which came out of Mechanization Takes Command. Mechanization thus ultimately appeared with the unconditionality and the inevitability of a natural phenomenon that made all moral appeals to restore the equipoise between thinking and feeling, or inner and outer reality, as it was occasionally called, look completely powerless. It is no accident that Giedion called this wishful idea a dynamic equilibrium, borrowing a term from the natural sciences. Well, we have to deal with the natural phenomenon after all. But even this small, meager vestige of optimism sank into an ultimately retrotropian longing for an alleged golden age that never existed, nor ever will exist. These demands were presented with great vehemence in the conclusions of the book. They were accompanied by an openly articulated rejection of the ideas of progress and human perfectibility as they had existed in European thought since the Enlightenment. And also the earlier faith in technology, which Giedion himself had fallen for, was rejected despite all fascination with its achievements in the modern era. Instead, the limited tolerance of man and nature towards that very same technology were this time emphasized. After the second great catastrophe of the 20th century, not much remained of the project of modernity, which Giedion had once championed with passion and immense dedication. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we have a few minutes left for questions on that, since really Giedion was trying to address some of the huge questions of 20th century life and industrialization. Let me throw this open to the floor now and see if there's anyone who wishes to take up any of the points either that Giedion made or indeed that were presented in this analysis of Gideon's writings. Yes, Peter? You may.
Thanks. I just briefly wanted to point to two big things. So the nasty review that I read out from, talking about the surrealist prose.
Yeah.
That was intended, obviously, as a criticism.
It was
But
by Gerlach.
Right.
Yeah.
But thinking about the context in which you put Giedion, would he have viewed it really as a criticism to say that his writing style, elusive, discontinuous, belonged to the movement of the 20s and 30s? Would he have seen that as such a criticism?
Mm-hmm.
Was he not trying to use the writing as itself a kind of technology to communicate something? That's one question. The other is to step back a little bit. I was thinking of so many of the associations. He's at Yale in New Haven after 1941. Cassirer arrives there in 1942, also the philosopher of the Enlightenment. thinking of Horkheimer and Adorno with their dialectic of enlightenment, which is such a parallel to the Janus characterization of mechanization here. The frog being tortured by science. This is discipline and punish, right? This is an early version of Foucault in the way in which modern society utilizes these kinds of methods of science. There's the Dr. Vater of his Dr. Vater, Burckhardt, and the attempt to create a kind of cultural history of a moment through these different kinds of portraits. I mean, and then finally, you talk about the subconscious inventive drive is anonymous, and one would think of Riegel and the Kunstwelle. So, you know, in a way, without saying so, you've located Giedion in the crosshairs of so many of these formative thinkers of cultural history.
Big questions, yeah. Well, the first question was about the criticism by Gerlach and whether Giedion would consider it as really critical. Okay. Well, as he said, he developed a particular technology of writing, which was an attention to facts on the one side, and on the other side, the shifting into more literary forms of expression as soon as he was going to deal with putting these facts into context. Okay, and I think he made it consciously. Besides, Giedion had a certain background in literature. I mean, in his early years, he wrote pieces of theater, poetry, and so on. So I think, after all, he was a trespasser of disciplines, and he would have considered the criticism rather as a compliment, you know, that he succeeded to really demonstrate how deeply connected he was with the artists of his time.
There's also the English problem, and it's a real problem for Giedion. I think all of what you said is totally true, but it wasn't his language. He was needing help from various people. I don't know, I feel I'm always reminded of what some of my very bright foreign students writing in a language that's not their own, sometimes very bold, and then sometimes the weirdest word choice. And, you know, like even that word equipoise, it's such a strange word at the end of the book. And you feel at times like he's just, you know, English, he was not a natural English writer. He struggled with space-time, and Reino Geiser has done some excellent work on the translation issues, and I think that may have affected some of the critics, apart from this probably very self-consciously avant-garde willingness that you described so beautifully. But I think the fact that it wasn't his native language and he was writing, I can't judge his German writing, which most of his books didn't get published in German first. I mean, his Architecture, You and Me, the only one that did besides Bauen and Frank.
The last German book was the 1928 book.
Yeah. And I don't know if, maybe
there was a
Architecture,
small
You.
publication, The Fight is Won.
Oh yeah, that's in German, which is like
1929.
little aphoristic lines.
And there is also the small monography on Gropius, which also appears in
German. Okay, but the big books are written in a language that is not his own, and he had to have help, and he was so bad at English when he gave the Gropius lectures. I mean, I think that has something to do with the critics responding to his writing.
I'm sure that's correct, and that's an important kind of very practical perspective. But I think there is this larger question, which one could put Giedion's reception into, of the way in which philosophically trained German writers, scholars, are received in an Anglophone academic environment that is really, like Hauser's review in the Art Bulletin is full of this, allergic to philosophical concepts. I mean, for them, a little bit like Gombrich at the Warburg, right? This is, writing philosophically is woolly-headed writing. And there's a kind of positivistic purging that somebody like Gombrich tries to put scholarship through. And I wonder if that, along with whatever difficulties Giedion would have had, would affect his reception in, let's say, American academic journals.
There's also a piece by Panofsky on the impact of the English language on his way of thinking,
Right.
which is.
But I don't think the book is philosophical in that tradition, the way that would alienate the typical Anglo-Saxon reader. It's too much of a montage, you know. That's where its experiment is. You know, he moves from one invention to another without. I don't know. I love the book. To me, it's like just so rich and full of life.
Well, as the
But the big
Shall we stop?
question.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think.
okay, we are about that. Yeah.
Hold on, so Mary, you were going to ask something
No,
else.
I mean, one of the things that you didn't mention that I just as a woman can't help but mention is the huge emphasis, because of the whole part on domestic life, women inventors. Women get a kind of credit and role that is so apart from most accounts of modernism. And I love it, you know, that Harriet Beecher and these figures get a presence, which is a whole different side of Giedion's, you know, whether you want to call it anonymity. Yes, they have names, but they were figures that weren't credited. And I think that's one reason the book has been so rich to subsequent, certainly feminist scholars and people working on the domestic environment.
Do you know if there's any critical recognition of that at the time of publication? I mean, talk about critical response. Is there any blip? I mean, is there any note of that?
I don't remember.
About this,
About
this
this
gender perspective.
Yeah, the recognition of women inventors, for instance.
Nothing.
Yeah, I would have thought.
He even consulted, like Charlotte Perriand, will you
Yeah.
send me things? He was, and he praises her, but he was, it's weird because space-time has almost zero. And something, and it even revises it to include Ino Alto after she dies. You know, why didn't he include her earlier? But something happens that he starts thinking a different way. I don't remember it ever being mentioned in the early reviews, do you? Issues of women.
Yeah, I
and
mean, I'd be
gender.
curious negatively or positively,
Yeah.
you know. But.
No, in Space Time and Arc there's no train. No.
Yeah, in the later edition, I know, appears,
No,
but it's
no trace.
it's minor.
Yeah, I think when I first read it, it was one of the first times I'd seen the word feminist, actually. And he uses that on several occasions through the book, which I thought was rather unusual at the time.
It is.
But in retrospect, perhaps it was much more common then than I had encountered.